wonder if it's ever struck you how curious a thing it is that most of the things that we experience we regard as things that happen to us, which we ourselves do not originate, which are events expressing some sort of power or activity that is external to ourselves. And if you consider that, you realize that what you mean by yourself is rather narrowly circumscribed. Even events that go on in our own bodies are put in the category of things that happen to us in the same way as things that go on in the world outside our skins. If there's a thunderstorm or an earthquake, well, it happens to you. You're not responsible for it. But so in the same way, when you have hiccups, you didn't plan on it. If you have belly rumbles, you had no intention of doing it. And as to the catastrophic act of getting born, well, you had nothing to do with that. And you can spend all your life blaming your parents for putting you in the situation in which you find yourself. And this way of looking at the world in this sort of passive mood as something that happens to you goes right down to our general feeling about life. It goes down to the way in which, as Westerners, we have been accustomed to look at human existence as a precarious event in a cosmos that, on the whole, is depicted as being completely unsympathetic and alien to our existence. In other words, if you're reared with a 20th century, or shall we say an early 20th century common sense, which is based on the philosophy of science in the 19th century, with its rejection of Christianity and Judaism, you regard yourself as an accident, a biological accident, in a stupid universe, which is mechanical, but has no feelings, no finer feelings. A vast, pointless gyration of radioactive rocks and gas in which you happen to occur. Of course, if you don't have that point of view and you are more traditional, you look upon yourself as a child of God. And therefore, under authority. In other words, there's a big boss on top of all this, who allowed you, at his pleasure, to deign to have the disgusting effrontery to exist. And you better watch your P's and Q's, because that Almighty is looking after you, with the attitude that this is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. And when you look at the world in that image, or in the other image that it's a stupid mechanism, either point of view you take, you don't really belong. You're not really part of all this. And I could use a stronger word than part, only we don't have it in English. We have to say something like connected with it, essential to it. Or to put it in the strongest possible way, it is quite alien to Western thought to conceive that the external world, which is defined as something that happens to you, and your body itself is something that you've got caught up with, it is quite alien to our thought to consider all that as you yourself. Because you see, we have such a myopic view of what oneself is. It's as if, in other words, we selected how much experience is really to be regarded as if you focused your attention on certain restricted areas of the whole panorama of things that you experience, and say, I will take sides with that much. start to an extremely important principle, which is the different points of view you get when you change your level of magnification. That is to say, you can look at something with a microscope and see it a certain way. You can look at it with the naked eye and see it in a certain way. You look at it with a telescope and you see it in another way. Now, which level of magnification is the correct one? Well, obviously, they're all correct, but they're just different points of view. You can, for example, look at a newspaper photograph under a magnifying glass, and where with the naked eye you will see a human face, with the magnifying glass you will just see a profusion of dots, rather meaninglessly scattered. But as you stand away from that collection of dots, which all seem to be separate and apart from each other, they suddenly arrange themselves into a pattern. And you see that these individual dots add up to some kind of sense. Now you'll see at once from this illustration that maybe you, when you take a myopic view of yourself, as most of us do, but you may add up to some kind of sense that is not apparent to you in your ordinary consciousness. When we examine our bloodstreams under a microscope, we see there's one hell of a fight going on. All sorts of microorganisms are chewing each other up. And if we got overly fascinated with our view of our own bloodstreams in the microscope, we should start taking sides, which would be fatal, because the health of our organism depends on the continuance of this battle. What is, in other words, conflict at one level of magnification is harmony at a higher level. Now, could it possibly be, therefore, that we, with all our problems, conflicts, neuroses, sicknesses, political outrages, wars, tortures, and everything that goes on in human life, are a state of conflict, which can be seen in a larger perspective as a situation of harmony? Well, it is claimed, you see, that some human beings have broken through to that vision, that they've slipped somehow or other into states of consciousness, where they see the apparent disintegration and disorganization of everyday life as the functioning of a totality, which at its level is completely harmonious. And you could say, aha, at last I see, I got the point. I've seen how all this makes sense. But what this insight depended upon was your overcoming the illusion that space separates things. That is to say, the space, the interval between your body and mine. The interval created by birth at one end and death at the other. And then after somebody's death, then somebody else's birth. These are events with intervals between them. And normally we regard these intervals in time and these intervals in space as having no importance, no function. We tend to see the universe itself as really consisting in all the stars and galaxies. That's what it is, that's what we notice. But the space in which all this happens is sort of written off as something that isn't really there. But what one has to realize is that the space is an essential function of the things in the space. After all, you can't have separate stars unless there is a space around. If you eliminate the space, you couldn't have this phenomenon at all. And vice versa. You couldn't have the space. They wouldn't be there in any sense whatsoever if there weren't the bodies in it. So the bodies in the space and the space are two aspects of a single continuum. They're related together in exactly the same way as a back and a front. And you just don't get one without the other. So the moment you see that intervals, that space is connective, you can understand at once how you are not just to be exclusively defined as a flash of consciousness that occurs between two eternal darknesses, which is the popular common sense view which Western man has of his own life. That you consider that in the darkness that comes before your birth, there was no you, and in the eternal darkness that follows your death, there is likewise no you. And I'm going to discuss these matters not by appealing to any special spooky knowledge, as if I had been traveling on the higher planes and knew all my previous incarnations and therefore could tell you authoritatively that you are much more than this individuality. I'm going to do it on a basis of complete common sense, that everybody has access to the facts. And that just what you have to realize is that life is a pattern of immense complexity. And what you call yourself as a living organism, say, I am my whole body at the very least. Now what is that body? That body is recognizable, and I recognize my friends when I meet them again, good luck, and you recognize me. Although the last time any of you saw me, I was absolutely something entirely different from what I am now. Just as the flame of a candle is never a constant. The flame of a candle is a stream of hot gas. Only you say the flame of the candle as if it were a constant. Well, it is a recognizably constant pattern. The spear-shaped outline of the flame and its coloration is a constant pattern. But in exactly the same way, we are all constant patterns. And that's all we are. The only thing constant about us at all is the doing rather than the being. It's the way we behave, the way we dance. Only there's no we that dances. There's just the dancing. Just as the flame is the streaming of hot gas, just as a whirlpool in a river is a whirling of streaming water. There is no thing that whirlpools. There is the whirlpool, and in the same way, each one of us is a very, very delightfully complex undulation of the energy of the whole universe. Only by our process of miseducation, we have been deprived of the knowledge of that fact, not as if there was someone to blame for this, because it's always with our own tacit consent. Because life is basically a game of hide and seek. Because life is pulsation, on and off. Here it is, now it isn't. And by being this pulsation, we know it's there. See, you don't know what you mean by on unless you know what you mean by off. That's why when we want to awaken someone, we knock at the door. Not enough to slam the door once with your fist and make a big noise, but you keep up a pulsation, because that by its on and offness attracts attention. All life, you see, is this flickering in and out. Only there are enormous rhythms in it. There are very fast flickering ins and outs, like the reaction of light upon our eyes, such that if I take a lighted cigarette in the dark and I spin it, you will see a circle of fire. Because the reflection of that cigarette tip on your retina lasts, it endures. Just in the same way as on a radar screen, an image stays a little while until it's revivified by another round. So in that way, you see, you notice continuity. And in the same way, then you notice the continuity of a light, because although, like say, with an arc lamp is actually a flickering light. And that's why they don't allow arc lights to be used in any shop where there's a circular saw moving. Because sometimes the flickering speed of the arc light so synchronizes with the turning speed of the teeth on the blade that the teeth look as if they're not moving. And so anybody who might put his hand on the blade would have it chopped off thinking it was a still one. So in this way, very fast impulses are looked upon as constant. And we see where there are fast impulses a solid thing. When you look at the blade of a propeller or an electric fan, the separated 4 or 3 blades become a solid disc, and you cannot throw an egg through it. Well, so in exactly the same way, you can't put your finger through a rock, because the rock is moving too fast for your finger to go through. That's the meaning of the whole phenomenon of hardness. Hardness in nature is immense energy, but acting in a very concentrated space, restricted space, it's going to beat hell. That's why you can't get through it. Now, from those very tiny fast rhythms, which give us the impression of continuity, there are also in this universe immensely slow rhythms. And these are very difficult for us to keep track of. And they impress us and depress us as our own life and death, as our coming and going, which goes for what is to us such a slow pace that we can't possibly believe that it is really a rhythm. We think of it as our birth as something quite unique that would never occur again, because we're so close to it, you see, and it's moving so slowly. And so with that point of view, we are like Marshall McLuhan said. He borrowed a metaphor from me, which is that we are driving a car looking at the rear vision mirror. That means that the environment in which you believe yourself to exist is always a past one. It isn't the one you're actually in. The process of growth, the basic process of biology, is one in which lower orders are always being superseded by higher orders. But the lower order can never figure out, or only very rarely figure out, what the higher order is that's taking over. And may see it as a terrible threat, as total disaster, as the very end. But therefore can never be aware that the principle of growth always has and always will continue. Because that's what's going on. But you never know what the next step is going to be. Because if you did know, you wouldn't take it. Because it would already be past. Do you understand this? That any certainly known future is an event of which we can say, you've had it. And in that sense, it's past. When we play a game, and we say in chess or in a bridge or whatever game you're playing, the outcome of the game becomes certain. We at that point cancel the game and begin a new one. Because the whole zest of the thing which takes me back to the idea that this whole thing is a hide-and-seek game. Is that you don't know what the next order coming up is. But one thing you can be sure of, it will be an order, and it will comprehend you. At the moment we stand at a time in history where we're beginning to think of a great countdown on the end of the human race. Terrifying possibility that through atomic energy we may obliterate this planet and turn the whole globe into a star. Maybe that's the way all the stars started. Imagine, there's a great thing coming up. The countdown on the end. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. heard that before? You sit on the seashore, and you hear the waves going in and out, and you don't stop to think. That's what you're doing. That's what the whole business is doing. And there are places where the wave mounts and mounts and it gets too big for its boots or whatever and it spills and breaks. We could do just that. But very important to realize that that's what you're doing, because then you don't get panicky about it. And the person who's going to press that button is the person who's going to be in panic. So if you realize that's what it is, and that it doesn't really matter if the whole human race blows itself up, then there's a chance that it won't do it. That's the only chance we have. Not to do this thing which attracts us like a kind of vertigo, like a person who looks over a precipice and is all set to throw himself over. Or a person who jumps out of a plane when they're skydiving and forgets to pull the parachute ring because he gets fascinated with a target. It's called target fascination. He just goes straight at it. So we can get absolutely fascinated with disaster, with doom. Or, all the news in the newspapers is invariably bad news. There's no good news in the newspaper. People wouldn't buy a newspaper consisting of good news. Even the free press is full of terrible news. Except the San Francisco Oracle. And the fascination, you see, for this doom might be neutralized if we would say, well, why bother about that? It's just another fluctuation in this huge, marvelous, endless chain of our own selves and our own energy going on. See, here's the problem. Because of our myopia, because of the way we've, as it were, restricted consciousness to focus upon just that certain little area of experience that we call voluntary action. That's us. Suppose you take in your hand one of those toys with a gyroscopic top, and you suddenly notice the minute you get this in your hand that it has a kind of vitality to it. It seems to resist you. It starts pushing you in a certain way, you see? And sometimes you're with it, following it. Then sometimes you see it's just as if you held a living animal. You pick up a hamster, or a guinea pig. You hold this little thing in your hand, it's always trying to escape. So the gyroscope always seems to be trying to escape your hold. Now in exactly the same way, what you're experiencing all the time, all sorts of things are getting out of control and doing things you don't expect. It's trying to escape your hold. Alright, then don't grab it. And you discover that this living thing that you're feeling, like the gyroscope top, it's your own life. Because you can see very simply that you would not understand the experience that you call voluntary action and decision, being in control, being yourself, unless in opposition to that there was something else. You couldn't realize self and control and will unless there was something other, out of control, and instead of will, won't. It's the two together only that produces the sensation that you call having a personal identity. Only, there is a funny thing about human consciousness which has been worked out very carefully in Gestalt psychology, which is that our attention is captured by the figure rather than the background, by the relatively enclosed area rather than the diffuse area, and by something moving rather than what is relatively still. And to all those phenomena that in this way attract our attention, we attribute a higher degree of reality than the ones we don't notice. That's only because, for the moment, those are more important. Consciousness, you see, is a radar that is scanning the environment to look out for trouble, just in the same way as a ship's radar is looking for rocks or other ships. And the radar, therefore, does not notice the vast areas of space where there are no rocks, no other ships. So in the same way, our eyes, or rather, the selective consciousness behind the eyes, only pays attention to what we think is important. I am at this moment aware, all of you in this room, of every single detail of your clothing, of your faces, and so on, but I'm not noticing it. And therefore I will not be able to remember tomorrow exactly how each one of you looked and what you were wearing. Because what I notice is restricted to things that I think are particularly important. If I notice some particularly beautiful girl in the audience, then I might notice also what you were wearing. And that would be memorable. But by and large, you see, we scan things over, but we pay attention only to what our set of values tells us we ought to pay attention to. And so in this way, we have this rather myopic way of looking at things. And we screen out from attention anything that is not immediately important to a scanning system based on sensing danger. But quite obviously, you as a complete individual are much more than the scanning system. You are in relationships with the external world that on the whole are incredibly harmonious. Going back to this illustration of every living body as something like the flame of a candle, the energies of life in the form of temperature, light, air, food, and so on, are streaming through you all at this moment in the most magnificently harmonious way. And you're, all of you, far more beautiful than any candle flame. Just sitting in these chairs, just going, you know? Only we're so used to it. We say about that, so what? Show me something interesting. Show me something new. Because it's a characteristic of consciousness that it ignores stimuli that are constant. When anything is constant, it says, okay, that's safe, it's in the bag, you need to pay attention to that anymore. And therefore we eliminate systematically from our awareness all the gorgeous things that are going on, all the time. And instead only become focused on the things, the troublesome things that might happen to upset it. Which is alright, but we make too much of it. And we make so much of it that we identify our very selves, I, ego, with the radar, with the troubleshooter. And that's only a tiny fragment of one's total being. So that if you do become aware that you are not simply that scanning mechanism, but you are your complete organism, then very swiftly in turn, as a consequence of that, you become aware that your organism is not the way you think about it when you look at it from the standpoint of conscious attention, from the standpoint of the ego. From the standpoint of the ego, your organism is your kind of vehicle, your automobile in which you go around. But from a physical point of view, your organism is again like the candle flame or the whirlpool. It is something which is a continuous patterning or activity of the whole cosmos. key idea here is pattern. Let's suppose I'm going to borrow a metaphor from Buckminster Fuller. Suppose we have a rope, and one section of this rope is made of manila hemp. The next section is cotton. The next section is silk. The next section is nylon, and so on. Now we tie a knot in this rope. Just an ordinary 1/over knot. You find by putting your finger in the knot, you can move it all the way down the rope. Now, as this knot travels, it's first of all made of manila hemp, it's then made of cotton, it's then made of silk, it's then made of nylon, and so on. But the knot keeps going on. That's the integrity of pattern, continuing pattern, which is what you are. Because you might, for several years you might be a vegetarian, you might be a meat eater, and so on, and your constitution changes all the time, and your friends still recognize it, but they're still putting on the same show. It's the same pattern. That is, the recognizable individual. But we are trained in our language, the very structure of the language we talk deceives us into misunderstandings. Because when we see a pattern, we ask, what's it made of? Like you see a table. Is it made of wood or is it made of aluminum? But then when you inquire, what is wood? And how does wood differ from aluminum? The only thing a scientist can tell you is the different patterns, that is to say, different molecular structure of the two things. And a molecular structure is not a description of what something is made of. It is a description of what dance it is performing. What motions, what kind of a symphony this is. Because basically, all phenomena of life are musical. And gold differs from lead in exactly the same way that a waltz differs from a mazurka. It's a different dance. And there isn't anything that's dance. That is a deception we get into because we have two parts of speech in our grammar. We have nouns and verbs. And verbs are supposed to describe the activities of nouns. And this is simply a convention of speech. You could have a language with only verbs in it. You don't need any nouns, or you could also have a language with the nouns only and no verbs. And it would have perfectly adequately describe what's going on in the world. So if you were used to speaking with a language that had one part of speech, you could say just as much as we can, with two, and be a lot clearer. Only at first it would sound awkward, but you'd soon get used to it. And then when you got used to it, it would be a matter of common sense that the patterning of the world is not some kind of stuff pattern. You don't have to seek for a substance underlying those things. It's patterning. And we're all that. And so in this way, there is, to a person who really wakes up, you'll very soon realize that your existence is not something that is just the hopeless little creature that's suddenly confronted with a great big external world that goes and eats him up. Every tiniest little thing that comes into being, every minute little fruit fly or gnat or bacterium, I will go so far as to say is an event upon which this whole cosmos depends. This thing goes both ways. It's not only that every little organism which exists depends on its total environment. The reverse is also true, that the total environment depends on each and every one of those little organisms. So that you could say, this universe consists of an arrangement of pattern, in which every event is essential to the whole thing. Now, we screen that idea out of our consciousness in exactly the same way that we screen out the perception of space as an important reality. Just as we pay attention to the figure and ignore the background, So we see one way of looking at things, mainly that the organism is very frail against the environment. It lasts a long time. The environment, but the organism only lasts a short time. What do you mean the environment lasts a long time? What does the environment consist of? Just a lot of little things. And yet there is the environment, just the same way as there is the face in the newspaper photograph behind all those little dots. When you get far enough away from it, you see the face. When you get far enough away from all the organisms and the little bits of things, you see the environment. In another scale of magnification. But actually, the whole thing is arranged in a polar system, where the enormous depends on the tiny, and the tiny depends on the enormous. And you get a relationship between these extremes, which can be called a transaction. That is to say, a transaction of buying and selling. It's impossible to have buying without selling, and selling without buying. So you always, wherever you are looking at the general panorama of sensory experience, try switching. Try shifting your attention to all the things you thought were unimportant, to the constants, to the background, and begin looking at the spaces between people. All painters have to learn this, because especially if you're working in oils, you actually have to paint in the background. Weavers know this, because when they're making patterns and weaving, they've got to weave the background as well. Or if you do needlepoint with embroidery, think of the hours you spend putting in the background over the canvas in wool. And you become aware of it. Same way the people who made the great Oriental carpets. They're much more aware of the background as constituting an essential part of the total experience. So, as you become aware of this, you'll see the same thing that you notice in music, namely that it is only as a result of hearing the interval between tones that you hear any melody. If you don't hear the interval, you're tone deaf, and all notes are the same noise. All you hear is rhythm. You don't hear any melody. You've got to hear the interval. So then watch the intervals between people. The things that aren't said, the things that are tacit, the things that are implicit rather than explicit in all life. And then you begin to get connected. Now it's very important to have a connection in life. And to be in the know. And this is the way it fundamentally comes out. Of seeing the thing you forgot. You know, you can always bug people in a beautiful way, in a very helpful way, by just saying to them, what did you forget? So, well, I don't know. Was I supposed to remember? Oh, I'm really not trying to put you on. I mean, it's not difficult. This is something completely obvious that you've forgotten. You'd easily remember it because it's so obvious. Well, that's the hardest thing in the world to think of. What's the most obvious thing I've forgotten? What's that? Well, who do you think you are? Well, how do you answer that question? Who are you? Well, you give a name. You say, I'm Joe Dokes, I'm Alan Watts. That's not true. That's what people told you you were. They put that name on you, and they taught you to identify with it and to behave as it was expected to behave. But that's not who you are. You know very well. Go back in your memory. Go back into your infancy before they started telling you all this stuff. Who are you? And if you get with that, you'll know very well who you are. The jolly old ancient of days. Only there's a conspiracy that you mustn't let on about that. Because everybody is. And if one person realizes it, the other's a little bit offended. And they say, well, how come you're so great? We worked it in Christianity by a very clever thing of allowing this one individual to be recognized as God incarnate. And nobody else, therefore, could be. And since he had been safely crucified and whisked up to heaven, he wouldn't bother us anymore. So everybody, therefore, who gets an intimation of who they really are and never comes out with it in Christian civilization, people say, who the hell do you think you are? You Jesus Christ? Well, you can say Jesus Christ said he was Jesus Christ, and everybody put him down for it, and that's what you're doing to me. Oh, they say, forget that one. Because it's like somebody comes out and composes some perfectly terrible music. The critics say this man is a cacophonist. He is completely incompetent. And he said, did you read the reviews of Beethoven's First Symphony when it was performed at Vienna? Now the thing is, we allowed one person, you see, one human individual, to be the incarnate God. Because we have all been living in a theory of the universe in which the individual is simply involved in something that happens to him. And we feel that this thing that happens to us is reality. It is facts that we have to face and accept and cope with. See? It's always something other than you. You don't recognize it as an integral part of your own being, without which you cannot know what you mean by the word I. But the truth of the matter is, though, that if you will face it out, every single one of us knows that that isn't true. There is as it were, a recess of the soul, of the psyche, where everybody knows perfectly well that you are not just this irresponsible little mouse that's been chucked down into this world, but that you are really doing this work. You're running it. Only you can't admit it, just in the same way as you can't admit that you're responsible for the way your own heart beats. You say, oh, that's not my doing. I've no control over my heart. Do you have any control over being conscious? Do you know how you will? Do you say, I intend to take my hand down from my face and put it on my leg? I could do that, but I don't know how the hell it's done. So that what we mean by the capacity of voluntary control in the ordinary sense of the word is that we don't understand it at all. So you might say, in a funny backwards way, that the only kind of control you really understand is that way you're not using your will. Because you just do it so easy, like you open and close your hand. You know how to do it. Sure you know how to do it. But you can't put it into words and explain to someone how to do it. You say, well, come on, aren't you human? Don't you know how to open and close your hands? Do it, silly. But we don't realize, you see, that just as we know how to do this, we know equally well how to turn the sun into light, how to blue the sky, how to blow the wind, how to wave the ocean, how to digest food, and I might add, to be digested by bacteria and transformed. As we transform our steaks, we will in turn be transformed. But the pattern keeps going. And it's always you. Only you see you have this marvelous capacity to transform yourself without knowing that you're doing it. Therefore you keep surprising yourself. And therefore you keep on doing it. Because if you didn't surprise yourself, you wouldn't go on doing it. It's just the very fact, you see, that you seem to be the victim of the thing you don't understand. and that you seem to conclude your life every time in a wipeout called death, where all your control goes, is just exactly that opposite condition to what you call being alive, that allows you to be alive. But every time it happens, it's like it's new. It's like every time you're born, it seems like it was the only time. But of course, if it wasn't like that, you wouldn't do it. When Hindus and Buddhists use the word karma, the basic meaning of it is action, from the Sanskrit root kri, to do. And therefore there is some error in the common translation of karma as a law of cause and effect, or of cosmic retribution. As a man sows, so also shall he reap. Has a Western flavor, which is a little causal. The way the Buddha put it was slightly different. This arises, that becomes. Because between this and that, there is a polar relationship. And the full explanation of karma in Buddhist philosophy is called pratitya samutpada, which means the interdependent origination of all the forms and phases of life. Pratitya samutpada. And there are 12 links, shall we say, in the chain of interdependent origination, constituting a circle. And the existence of the circle depends on the presence of every one of the links. From one point of view in Buddhism, the chain of interdependent origination is looked upon as a chain, that is to say, as a form of bondage. The constituents, as it were, of the vicious circle in which most people and beings are living, which they call samsara, S-A-M-S-A-R-A, samsara, the round of birth and death, the bhava chakra, the wheel of bhava which is becoming. And so going round and round and round in the endless game of hide and seek is from one point of view bondage. Bondage to karma. And if you study the Bhagavad Gita, which is not a Buddhist book but a Hindu scripture, Krishna, the spokesman of the Gita, explains that the wise man is one who does what is called nishkama karma, nishkama, N-I-S-H-K-A-M-A, meaning passionless activity, in the sense that he acts without seeking a result, without being motivated by the fruits of action, and therefore is not bound by his own action. You can be bound to samsara, the wheel of birth and death, by iron chains or gold chains. The chains, I'm talking in more or less the language of popular Hinduism, that if you do bad deeds in this life, you will get a bad result next time. If you do good deeds in this life, you may be reborn as an angel or as a monk, in which you'll get a better chance of liberation. But still, so long as you're looking for results, be they good or evil, you're still bound. Now, the way in which one becomes, as it were, free of karma involves another Buddhist point of view, which is a kind of a different way of looking at the chain of interdependent origination. It's the way which the Japanese call jijibuge. That is to say, the mutual interpenetration of all things and events. So that You could say, actually, in fact, the deepest level of reality, this entire cosmos is a completely harmonious and blissful manifestation of everything in a state of total enlightenment and mutual compassion. And therefore the task of the Buddhist or the Hindu discipline of meditation, sadhana, the way of spiritual development, is to realize that for everybody, to realize it effectively in his own life, and therefore cease from the illusion that the universe is a fragmented process of conflict. But first of all, we have to be clear about karma, that it is not to be understood in the Western sense of a law of cause and effect, or of a sort of retribution system, or a law. The word law is most unsuitable for concepts in Eastern, Indian and Chinese philosophy. The word dharma, D-H-A-R-M-A, sometimes meaning the Buddhist doctrine or a certain way of life. When you talk about a person's svadharma, you mean their own function. We would translate svadharma as vocation. Sva is the same as the Latin suus, one's own. Dharma, function in this case, operation, way of life, style of life, profession, trade, role, means all those things. And the one thing that Dharma really never means is law, although it's often translated that way. Because you see, you don't get the idea of law until you move to a culture where order is based on the idea of obedience. Well, in the West, you see, the origins of law spring from where? The laws of the Medes and the Persians, the laws of Hammurabi, the laws of Moses, and later Roman law. The only healthy legal tradition we have in the West is British common law, which proceeds in an entirely different way from code law. Because you see, the difference between code law and common law is that code law is laid down by the wisdom of an all-powerful ruler who tells everybody how they must behave, they must obey him. But common law is evolved by discussion of particular cases, rather than referring all the time to abstract principles which are put down in words. And the judge, the good judge, is a wise man, a man with a sense of equity and fair play, who arbitrates an issue which is debated in front of him, and from the precedent which he creates by his decision, common law evolves. You see, that's a more organic way of producing law. The code law system, which we inherit from our most ancient theological backgrounds, is a tyrannical method of law by imposition. And so we must understand that in both Hinduism and Buddhism, there is really no fundamental idea of obedience to a personal ruler. Certainly not in Buddhism, a little bit sometimes in Hinduism. But even then we get terribly mixed up because, for example, I was talking of the Bhagavad Gita. This is often translated the Lord's Song. Now for Bhagavan or Bhagavat in Sanskrit, Lord is an English equivalent, is quite inappropriate. Because a Lord is one who lords it over you. Bhagavan is a title of reverence and respect and love. The Song of the Beloved would be much better in a way, although it's not quite correct from a strict point of view. We don't really have an equivalent for this word, the Bhagavan. So, although you see there has been in India itself tyrannical rule, and although the Arthashastra as a manual of politics, it gives directions to its tyrant as to how to govern by absolute power. Going along with this exposition of this very Machiavellian point of view of government is the constant advice of the sage. Yes, this is what you have to do in order to fulfill your office as a ruler, but never forget that you'll never succeed. The more you try to rule things by force, the more you will stir up violence against you. And so you can never hold on to your power and your possessions. It will always flow away from you. So there was was one of those great Rajas of ancient India who asked a jeweler to make him a ring that would restrain him in prosperity and support him in adversity. And the jeweler wrote on the ring, "It will pass." But whenever we come to the deep cosmological and metaphysical ideas, we don't have law in the Western sense, and therefore nature is not looked upon as something which is an orderly system because it is obeying a commandment. In the West, we inherit the idea of law from those ancient conceptions of God, and it is even passed down into science, where we discuss laws of nature. But one recognizes more and more in the sciences that what we call laws of nature are simply observed regularities in the way things behave. And in order to observe regularities, you must look at things through something regular. That is to say, you must lay a ruler alongside them, or compare their behavior with the regular behavior of a clock. But clocks and rulers are human inventions. They are regular measures which we use for comparing the rates of change. Say a clock is a measure of a rate of change. It's quite arbitrary. But we very easily compare our regulation measuring devices with what makes things happen. As if the sun rises because it's 6 in the morning. That's being completely backwards in one's thinking. And we get into the same confusion when we imagine, for example, that money is wealth. Here we have fantastic wealth, you know, and we have the technological possibility of making everybody on Earth the enjoyer of an independent income. We can't do it because people say, "Where's the money going to come?" Because they think money makes prosperity. It's the other way around. It's physical prosperity, which has money as a way of measuring it. But people think money has to come from somewhere, like hydroelectric power or lumber or iron. And it doesn't. Money is something we invent, like inches. So you remember the Great Depression? When there was a slump? And what did we have a slump of? Money. There was no less wealth, no less energy, no less raw materials than there were before, but it's like you came to work on building a house one day, and they said, "Sorry, you can't build this house today, no inches." What do you mean no inches? Not just inches. We don't mean we got inches of lumber. Yes, we've got inches of metal. We've even got tape measures. But there's a slump in inches as such, see? And people are that crazy. They can have a depression because they've got no inches to go around, or no dollars. That's all a lot of nonsense. But you see, because we get thinking backwards, making the metaphysical tail wag the dog, making the law rule things, whereas it doesn't. It's a way of measuring what happens. And so you see, when you get into Buddhistic thought, you don't get that confusion. You're the other way around. So you're looking at a system where, if you go back to the Buddha's words, this arises, that becomes, which is a way of saying, you can't have this without that. You can't have here without there. You wouldn't know where here was unless you knew where there was. And they come into being together. You don't get first here and then there, or first there and then here. These arise interdependently. That's the meaning of interdependent origination. And to grasp the idea of interdependent origination is as important as the idea about seeing how things are related by space and intervals. And seeing, therefore, that you tend to look at life from a myopic point of view and see details, see the trees and not the forest, see yourself as something loosely related to everything else that's going on and not integral to it. You see the figure, but ignore the background. But the figure and the background arise mutually. They are to each other as this is to that. And so, we really have to rid our brains of the notion of causality. The notion of causality being that present sets of circumstances are the result of past sets of circumstances. And that therefore certain events, which are called causes, are responsible for following events called effects. And all this is an enormous piece of mumbo-jumbo. Because what is not seen and what is not clear in thinking that way is that in physical nature there are no separate events. This is startling to people. But it's really quite easy to see that there are no events in nature. Because you can ask very simply, let's take something called an event. How do we demark it from other events? At what point, shall we say, were you born? Were you born at parturition? Or when the doctor slapped you on the bottom, or cut the umbilical cord, or when you were conceived, or when your father and mother were first attracted to each other? When was it? When did you begin? There's no way of deciding except arbitrarily. And for legal purposes we say you were born at parturition. And that's when the astrologer casts your horoscope, except that other astrologers disagree and want the conception time. Say that's the real beginning. But there isn't a real beginning. It goes back and back and back in an inseparable continuity. When are you dead? That's another big argument. And you can get all kinds of ideas about that. So once you see that an event is a term in an intellectual calculus, calculus being the way of measuring, say, curve formations, by reducing them to point instants and counting it, see? But actually, the point instants are imaginary. The curve wiggles along, and it doesn't stutter from point to point. But in calculus, you make it do that. So, just as there are no point instants in the curve, so there are no events in nature. Nature is a constantly fluctuating pattern. You can only designate particular wiggles in a pattern arbitrarily. You can count a convex formation as one wiggle, or a concave formation as one wiggle. Then you decide if you call it one way. Well, if you give the convex properties the title of wiggle, you have to deny the concave properties, and vice versa. So when you see that what we call separate events don't exist, it becomes nonsense to speak of one event causing another. What you really mean is that the two events which you speak of as being causally related are simply two parts of the same event. They go with each other in the same way as this with that. The relationship is not causal. It is mutual. And it works two ways in time, because future, so-called future events, are not merely passive to past events. But you could easily see when, for example, any biological process goes on, you can reason just as well from the future to the past as from the past to the future. Why do two mammals have sexual intercourse? Well, it isn't just that they enjoy it. It's also that they're a very complex system which does this because it makes babies. And the prospect of baby works in reverse and creates desire. You can reason that way. Well, it's silly. Because the whole process is one. And when we speak humanly and purposefully, I'm going downtown to buy groceries. Then a future event could be said to be the cause of why you're now starting out to get into the car. Buying groceries. Now the difficulty we have in seeing this to be so is that we think in an either-or way. What is called dualism in Hindu-Buddhist thought, and that liberation is being free from dualism. So when you think in an either-or way, you see the figures in the background as moving, and therefore being responsible for their action. But if somebody argues the other way around and say the figures are just following lines of force in the field, gravitational principles say we're all human beings, we're all concentrated on our fact that we're individually rushing around and doing this and that. But we don't see that we're equally sucked, and that we move around in response to all sorts of stimuli. But neither position is adequate. You have to see that our being sucked by all sorts of stimuli is exactly the same thing as our apparently voluntary and deliberate action. Because what we're looking at is not this Newtonian game of billiards, where balls roll because they are hit by cubes. What we're involved in is a dance where, for example, watch a snake. When a snake swims, there's nothing more beautiful than watching a snake swim in water. Lovely motion. But you see, it wiggles along, and its wiggle is conceivable, you see, as convex or what is concave, this way, and that way, and this way, and that way. Now, which side of the snake moves first when it wiggles? It's very easy to see there. Now, when we interact with the world, what moves first? Who starts it? The objective world or the subjective world? But they are related as this and that. You can't have an object without a subject or a subject without an object. You can't have something known without the knower. And that gives the show away. There isn't any real distinction between the knower and the known. There's two ways of looking at something, yes. Two poles of a single process. But the knower and the known are subsumed as the knowing. And all life is knowing. The being, becoming. And it isn't something, in other words, that works by the idea of all this happens because someone shoves it. Now you see, the idea of all this happens because someone shoves it is basic to Western thinking. There is the Lord God, who is the boss, and he flushes this universe into being and shoves it and sets it going. And you better obey that shove, because he's introduced into it some recalcitrance by giving to human beings what the Hebrews call the Yetzer Hara, the wayward spirit, so that they shall be able to play certain games on their own. Because nothing very interesting would happen if everybody obeyed God. The whole world would be like a lifeless thing. So they had to reason that into it in order to save face of God, practically. Because otherwise he could be blamed for all the catastrophes that happen, instead of our being able to say to each other, well, it's our fault. But you see that once we are up against this possibility that the distinction between what we do and what happens is obliterated. And therefore we would say with Hindus and Buddhists that if I run into a catastrophe, it is my karma.
And certainly this indicates that we are ready for freedom. We're ready to march for it. All we want you to do is keep going with this fight for freedom. And as we stick together, when we get this unity, ladies and gentlemen, nothing can stop us. We're going to win this fight for freedom. Thank you very much.
So you see, that means far more than that it is a punishment for something I did wrong in the past. That is a legalistic view of karma. But a naturalistic or organic view of karma is, in fact, that what happens to me is what I do. And that in a certain sense, I want what happens to me. We can use want, notice how we use this word. It means to desire, and it means to lack, or to need. We say to somebody, you're wanting, you're deficient in something that you need. So it's rather alarming, really, when you consider it, that you always get what you want. Invariably. Even though you may think that it's entirely opposed to your wishes. But if it's your karma, everything that happens to you, put it in another way, everything that comes to you is a return to you of what goes out of you. Yes, obviously that's absurd. If you confine the definition of yourself to your voluntary, conscious behavior, that's a ridiculous definition of oneself. Oneself, by any stretch of the imagination, must involve far more than the conscious and voluntary aspects of our behavior. And if we see that it involves intimately and inescapably the behavior of what we call the other, the not-self, the environment, and see that these two are moving together like the two sides of the snake when it swims, then you get a very curious feeling. You have to be careful of it if you've got a Western background. Because this is what happens to a lot of people who play around with psychedelic chemicals. There are many, many cases of inflation among these people. That is to say, when you get this sensation that the two sides of the world, the inside and the outside, are moving together, you may think, I am ruling it. I am God in the Western sense of the word. Therefore, your ego, instead of being, as it were, integrated and transcended with all this process, merely assumes vast dimensions, as megalomania is blown up by the mystical experience. And so you get the millions of people going around who seem to think that they're above all human conventions and have no obligations to anyone or anything, because they're divine and they can do as they damn please. What they haven't realized is that doing as you will isn't a new kind of behavior that you suddenly put on and say, from now on I'm going to go around doing as I will. You have to realize first that that's what you've always been doing. And you can look at this from a very simple point of view. It's not a complete point of view. But you can say, well now what about the people who did good and who did the things that they didn't want to do? You know, everybody's mother said, darling, sometimes we have to do things we don't like. What about that? Well, you can always say, the kid obeyed the mother and did the thing that he didn't like because that was the better part of wisdom. In other words, if he hadn't done that, something worse would have happened. And we choose the lesser of two evils. And when you find yourself in a situation where you have to choose the lesser of two evils, then you say, I want out of here. You take the easiest way, you take the line of least resistance. So that's your doing. Now, you pursue that more profoundly when you stop thinking about human behavior as something that responds to the compulsion of an environment. And you can get out of that when you see the behavior of the environment as an essential aspect of you. So it isn't, as it were, the environment starting something, which you are therefore compelled to follow. It's the whole system moving together. So then, you get in the state of liberated or mystical consciousness, you very often feel the hill is lifting you up as you walk up it. The ground seems to heave beneath your feet, and up you go. And you get this strange feeling of lightness, of effortlessness. Walking on air, never a care, you know. This wonderful sense that there are no obstructions anywhere. There's nothing, as it were, banging you and making you do that. It all flows together. That's a very common sense. You are actually, in that state of consciousness, you are perceiving the goings-on, the Tao, the course of nature, in the way it's happening. But in the ordinary way, you've been conditioned to resist it, to fight it, and to use those sensations of resistance to create a sensory basis for what you describe as the ego. The ego, in practice, is a sense of strain. When you are aware of I, you are aware of a basic discomfort, which is located basically between the eyes, somewhere in here, a sort of tightness. Also, it's in other centers too. It's in the solar plexus, and there are various physical centers, in other words, where this constant tension or resistance against it is going on. And that's what you feel when you talk about I. When that tension ceases, you discover immediately that the separate ego has disappeared, and that what I refer to is simply the total panorama of experience, everything that's happening. That's I. And obviously I don't know all of it, because I can't inspect all of it with my radar, with my conscious attention. That would be a ridiculous undertaking, to know everything in that sense. We know it in a much better way, as we know how to grow hair and open and close our hands. So, this point of view can be understood if we clarify the initial problems we have about it. And I suppose the first problem is if we accept the notion that everything that happens to us is our own karma, our own doing, then we have to be very careful of, shall we say, the devil of omnipotence, of inflation, of feeling that your ego is what is in control of all this. And the second thing is, if you think then that everything that happens to everybody is what they really want to happen, then you can absolve yourself from any qualms about being unkind to someone. Because you could say, well, the unkindness I did you was what you really wanted, wasn't it? You know that business about the responsibility of the person who gets murdered for getting murdered? There is a curious sense in which a lot of people go around looking for trouble. Freud pointed out quite correctly the psychology of accident-prone individuals. They seem to be attracting trouble like lights attract moths. And we're all doing that, but we manage to remain unconscious of it, so that we can praise and blame, and play the game that says, that's not my fault, that's your fault. And so we go around apportioning faults to everybody. Because if we're going to apportion praise for what good things people do, you can't make praise mean anything unless you also go around blaming. Praise and blame go together. Supposing everybody was acting in a praiseworthy way, and we praised everybody for everything, they'd get tired of it. They wouldn't even notice it anymore. So long as you're going to get a kick out of being praised, you've got to go around blaming too. It's very simple. But if you see the folly of that, the praising and blaming are just creating each other. Then you don't praise and you don't blame. You just dig the whole thing. And that's why, when we encounter very great sages, you never hear them blame people, and they very rarely praise anyone. You try to start gossip in the presence of such a person, and you make a derogatory comment about someone. It's as if you had thrown a rock into a well and heard no splash. And a funny feeling, because that you get no response. You get no agreement. And if you praise somebody, there's also likely nothing to be said, except perhaps some remark that, of course, you're praising the beloved in all its manifestations. And this disconcerts some people terribly. I've always noticed that real sages never gossip, never criticize persons, and because they understand so well. The French saying, tout comprendre c'est tout pardonner, to understand all is to forgive all, is so true if you are experienced in just the ordinary way of dealing with human problems. If you've been a counselor or psychotherapist or minister or anything like that, you very soon get to realize how vastly complicated people are, and to see that they really are in the messes they're in, not because of anything. But that's the way it is. And you stop blaming people. And because you don't blame people, you have open ears and people come and seek your advice. Because they don't want to come to someone who's a counselor who will bawl them out. It's like dentists who simply accept the fact that people really don't take care of their teeth. And realize that the job of a dentist is precisely to look after people who can't be bothered to take care of their teeth. That's why he's in business. So a good dentist doesn't call his patients out because they didn't do this, that, and the other. Just accept it. Same with doctors. They know perfectly well that nobody's going to live by the rules of health. And they're very vague as to what they are. You know, there's every kind of theory about how you ought to live, what is healthy, but they've changed in fashion. And you ought to eat this kind of diet in 1921. By the time it's 1930, they've changed their ideas altogether. By the time it's 1960, it's back again to a mixture between 1921 and 1894. Something like that. It's always changing. So, while the rules are not so... You see, if they were all absurd, it would be easy. But they're not all absurd. There's some truth in it, always. But nobody's ever quite sure. So the function of healers and doctors and so on is just to do what can be done to stop the mess getting too messy. And they must accept it as that. That's their job. If I were healthy, say to the doctor, I wouldn't need you. So you're in business. Now, what about it then? We have difficulty in seeing this mutuality of our relationship to the rest of the world because it's contrary to common sense, contrary to the way we've been brought up. And therefore we have what I would call an initial intellectual block to understanding it, quite apart from any emotional blocks or anything of that kind. But obviously, we must overcome that intellectual block if we're going to go any further and actually realize and feel this way of life's working, this relationship between what you do and what happens to you. Do I go around saying to myself, all this that's happening to you is what I wanted? I am inside and outside. I am the subjective and I am the objective. And you remember, you go around thinking thoughts about this, so as it were to talk yourself into this way of feeling. Well, that's very superficial. Because this new sense of relationship to nature is something much more than an idea. See, ecologists and physicists have the idea that this is so. But they mostly, in their private life and in their ordinary human behavior, are just like other people who don't feel it and who feel themselves in a Newtonian billiards game, even though they've gone on to quantum mechanics. So that there may be a transition from our ordinary way of feeling how things go on to the new way. We have to do something other than think. Because actually thinking is causing the trouble. It is by thinking that we divide the world into separate events and separate things. That is calculus. And Ananda Kumaraswamy once described the life of the liberated being as a perpetual, uncalculated life in the present. And you say, oh wow, I don't think I can do that. That saying of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, be not anxious for tomorrow. The uncalculated life. If God so clothed the grass of the field, will he not much more clothe you, faithless ones? And I've never met a preacher yet who would really take that up. They all say, well, of course, that's too hard a saying for most of us. It's not practical. Everybody has to take thought for tomorrow and calculate. Well, at this point, people can go in two directions. There's one class of people who will say, all right, let's live the uncalculated life. Let's not make any plans. And before you know where they are, they're living in a filthy pad and scrounging around, living on petty thievery and so on. This is the usual thing. This is got into it the wrong way. The first thing to do is just as I said. Whether you like it or not, and whether you know it or not, the relationship between you and the environment is always one that is harmonious. So in the same way, you are always living the uncalculated life. You have to find out, first of all, that you're always doing it. And that what you call your calculations, the things you did, were funny little rationalizations. In other words, your ego has about as much control over what goes on as a child sitting next to its father in a car with a plastic steering wheel that is turning the car the way Daddy drives it. Because, as I pointed out, most of the functions, most of the goings-on, in you, around you, the circumstances of life, have nothing to do with your ego at all. And you don't even know why you make up your mind to do certain things. We know superficially we have a few ideas. It's like when you enter into a marriage. You have really no control over its outcome, in the ordinary sense of ego control. You've taken a colossal gamble in which you've involved enormous complexes of patterns. And maybe it'll come out all right if you don't interfere with it too much. Like Oppenheimer said, it's perfectly obvious that the whole world is going to hell. And the only possible way we might stop that happening is not to try to prevent it. You know, all these wars are started out by people who think that they're helping someone. But it's going to make things better. So, when you begin from the basics, not of saying, I should now live the spontaneous and improvident and non-calculating style of life, but realize you've always done that. Only you rationalize that you didn't. You always did what you wanted to do. Basically. Only you said sometimes it was my duty. But you preferred a conception of yourself as someone who always does his duty. That flattered you. And so you were still following your own way. Now the first thing then is to see that. That's what's happening. So that you don't think, well now, there is some special thing I have to do to understand this harmonious relationship between the individual and the world. Because if you work on it that way, you will start from the presupposition that that relationship doesn't already exist and has to be brought into being. The thing is, it doesn't have to be brought into being. It's there. But now when you see that that's so, it obviously starts to make a difference. You do behave in a different way. But the behavior, the new kind of behavior that is a result of a transformation, is not forced behavior. When you try to imitate the way a saint behaves, you have made a forced change, and you know all forced behavior is phony. It's like someone saying, I love you, I love you, I love you, when you don't. You feel you ought to, but you don't really. And there's something that doesn't ring true. Well, think of the poor Lord, listening to all the prayers of all those people saying, I love you, Jesus. And he knows they don't. They're just saying this because they think they ought to. And they're very trying. So, whenever you do a thing like that, you see, you make a forced change. Now, if the change is to happen in the same way that a seed at proper season breaks open and sends up a shoot, you see, it comes from the whole force of life itself. Now, when you see that without your having to do anything, see, you are living the uncalculated life, and you're only pretending you're calculating it and arranging it, then, as it were, you will have a grasp of the total situation, and it will, you can allow it to produce changes in action, which are not forced. So this is why there is always a trend in every kind of spiritual doctrine which says something about grace, divine grace. There must come about something in you of change which you can't produce. And if you try to produce it, you will be a victim of spiritual pride. But on the other hand, all the teachers are universally saying, you've got to make an effort. way to get it across to people. That you, as a separate effort maker, are a myth, are a phantasm. Because if you really try to control your mind, and only think the thoughts that you think are good thoughts to think, you will find that you're going round in a circle. Krishnamurti is awfully good at pointing this out. When people ask him, how do you meditate? He says, why do you want to meditate? Why are you concentrating? Why are you saying prayer? Why do you think you should believe in God? And it always comes out because I'm just a son of a bitch. I mean, I'm out for my own good, and this seems to be the way. So he says, you see, you don't have any genuine love at all. It's all fake. And so you have to find, first of all, where the genuine love is. Now you love you, don't you? That's genuine. We won't argue about that. But then, when you start from this, I gave a talk some time ago to the Air Force. Their camp, lab where they make weapons, do all the research. And they got a bunch of us there who were ministers and philosophers. And they had the nerve to ask us, what was our basis for moral behavior, personal moral behavior? Well, I said, my basis for moral behavior is pure selfishness.
And there's nowhere you're supposed to be, there's nothing you're supposed to do, there's nowhere you're supposed to go, and you find you're in an eternal here and now. That's your way of discovering who you are.
Of how the universe works and what man's place in it is. I want you to do something that expresses you. No more playing games with me. I want to see you.
And I'm talking, after all, to realistic people here, and I don't think we need to be sentimental and beat about the bush. After all, you're all warriors, fighters, and so on, and you know how rough things are. So I'm going to say to you frankly, I'm out for me. Of course, I don't do it in a tactless way. I don't go around and hit people over the head and say, give me this, give me that. I'm much more subtle. I say, with good manners, please, and how nice you are, and so on. And finally, people feel massaged psychologically to the state where they'll give. But then there's some things that bother me. The first one is, I love me. What do I want? And furthermore, who am I? Because if I'm going to be realistic about getting what I want, I've got to be pretty sure what it is that's me and what is the state of desire in me. If I am desire, if I am a center of desire, what's it all for? Well, I think of all the things I want. But it so turns out that none of them are me. When I say I want dinner, I mean I'm going to eat me up. If any pleasure I can think of is the enjoyment of something that I hadn't thought of defining as myself. Because I like my sensations. I like what happens to my body when I take a fine wine and down it. But then what's the difference between my body and the wine? So I say I like the wine. I also mean I like me and the wine together. The mixture. But then I don't eat you or a friend or a lover in the same way as I drink wine. I live in association like this. But then I'm loving things that aren't formally supposed to be me. And as I go into it, in other words, as I investigate what I mean by me, I find that I can't put any limits on it. That I cannot experience me without you. Or without the other. They're inseparable. But you don't find this out until you investigate. Until you really go into the question, what do I want? And that's the most important investigation anyone can make, which I'm going to do in the next session. The question of power. And all these military men, you think they want power. And so I said to them some very subversive and undermining things, without anybody knowing it, long after I left. Curious that a cardinal feature of the Buddha's doctrine is that craving is the root of suffering. But craving, going further back to another root, is ignorance. Avidya, in Sanskrit, means lack of vision. The video, that is, I see. And that's related back to Sanskrit vidya. Avidya, unseeing, unconsciousness, lies behind craving. And this in its turn lies behind suffering. And of course, when the West first heard about this, we interpreted the idea in a very crude way, which is this. That all one's disappointments are the result of frustrated desire. And but it's a very much more subtle point of view than that. To understand Buddhism in any case, you must realize that
what is going on? You simply are aware of what it is. And nobody can say what it is because the real world is unspeakable. And there's nowhere you're supposed to be, there's nothing you're supposed to do, there's nowhere you're supposed to go, and you find you're in an eternal here and now. That's your way of discovering who you are.
Of how the universe works and what man's place in it is. I want you to do something that expresses you. No more playing games with me. I want to see you.
Something like a teaching, as we ordinarily understand the system of teaching. It isn't simply a way, as we have in our universities, of a teacher imparting you certain authoritative information, which when you've heard it, you've got the message. It's a dialogue. It's situation in which the teacher doesn't really have anything to tell you. He's simply reacting to your own bringing up our problems. And it's as if people came to the Buddha and said, "Sir, we suffer terribly. What are we going to do about that?" And he replies, "Is it not true that you suffer because you desire?" They said, "Well, maybe that makes sense." "All right," he said, "see if you can do without desire." And all those students go away and see if they can calm their desires. They come back and say, "This is pretty difficult. Because we're animal beings and we have all these appetites to begin with. And then beyond that, we're in the unfortunate position of being aware of time, being aware of the future. And although it's advantageous to know about the future, in the long run it's depressing. Because we all know that we come to a bad end. And that everything falls apart in time. That would be especially true if you lived under the influence of Indian cosmology, where the world is regarded as a process that begins beautifully, but as it goes on, gets worse and worse till it destroys itself. Then there's a long period of rest, and it starts out again, beginning beautifully, but getting worse and worse all the time. Everything runs down in time according to that cosmology. And so there seems to be a fundamental futility. Desire for whatever it is that you want. But behind this, the intention of studying desire, seeing whether one can discipline desire, whether one can curb it, is a deeper question altogether, which is, what do you desire? What makes you itch? What sort of a situation would you like? Let's suppose, I do this often in vocational guidance of students. They come to me and say, "Well, we're getting out of college and we have the faintest idea what we want to do." So I always ask the question, what would you like to do if money were no object? How would you really enjoy spending your life? Well, it's so amazing as a result of our kind of educational system. Crowds of students say, "Well, we'd like to be painters, we'd like to be poets, we'd like to be writers, but as everybody knows, we can't earn any money that way." Or another person says, "Well, I'd like to live an out-of-doors life and ride horses." I said, "You want to teach in a riding school? Let's go through with it. What do you want to do?" When we finally got down to something which the individual says he really wants to do, I will say to him, "You do that. And forget the money." Because if you say that getting the money is the most important thing, you will spend your life completely wasting your time. You'll be doing things you don't like doing in order to go on living, that is, to go on doing things you don't like doing, which is stupid. Better to have a short life that is full of what you like doing than a long life spent in a miserable way. And after all, if you do really like what you're doing, it doesn't matter what it is, you can eventually turn it, you could eventually become a master of it. The only way to become a master of something is to be really with it. And then you'll be able to get a good fee for whatever it is. So don't worry too much. Somebody's interested in everything. And anything you could be interested in, you'll find others who are. But it's absolutely stupid to spend your time doing things you don't like in order to go on spending things you don't like and doing things you don't like, and to teach your children to follow in the same track. See, what we're doing is we're bringing up children and educating to live the same sort of lives we're living, in order that they may justify themselves and find satisfaction in life by bringing up their children, to bring up their children to do the same thing. So it's all wretched and vomit. It never gets there. And so, therefore, it's so important to consider this question: what do I desire? Well, when we answer that question in a naive way, we figure out that we want to desire, or what we want is to control everything, to create Girls that don't grow old, apples that don't rot, clothes that never wear out, conveyances that get from one place to another instantly so we don't have to wait, power available to do anything that you could conceive and do it just instantly like that. You get this funny technological omnipotence. But if you take time out to think about that, and really go into it with your full strength of imagination, and find out whether that's where you want to be, you will soon see that's not what you want. Because the moment you have a situation where you are really in control of things, that is to say, in which the future is almost completely predictable, you will see, as I said last night, that a completely predictable future is already the past. You've had it.
What interests me is just like what interests everyone.
That's not what you want. You want a surprise.
What feels
You don't know what that's going to be, because obviously it wouldn't be a surprise if you did. You want a pleasant surprise. But like you say, what sort of a surprise would be pleasant? And you can't really answer that. Because you know, if there are to be such things as pleasant surprises, there must also be unpleasant surprises. There must be rude shocks. So you're like somebody taking one of those wishing well boxes, tubs, where you fish in and bring out a package. And you don't know whether you've got a dead rat in it or a new camera. And that's the way. That seems to be the thing that really excites people. But quite certainly there comes out of this inquiry a feeling of real disillusionment with the ideal of power. To be in power, to be in control, is not something that any sensible person wants. Imagine the situation with Big Brother. Mr. J. Edgar Hoover, Heinrich Himmler, to be glued day and night to a highly defended office with telephones, television screens, watching, peeking, spying on everyone and anything, getting all this information together. Why? You can never leave the office. I mean, there's people characterized as like Hoover goes home in the evening, and when he's back home, you know, there are guards sitting outside the door. There's that hotline telephone doing something. He's always having to be in control, and he can't take any time off. He can't go for a walk in the park with a friend, or go innocently to the movies, or sit down and just relax, have an undistracted party in the bar. That's a big Sur. Yeah, what a pauper this guy is. Completely deprived. Because he wants to be in control, because he wants power. People are frustrated in love. If you're jilted, there's a natural tendency to human beings to seek power as a substitute. And that's a very negative thing. It's like having a bad temper. To seek power after you're frustrated in love, you should try and get back on the love beam. Because nobody wants power. Now you may say that's shirking responsibility. That if you were a really responsible person, you would go out for power and try to use power to the best possible advantage for the benefit of all. Alright, what would be the benefit of all? Ask them. What do you want me to do with this power? I'm dictator. What would you like me to do? Well, nobody knows, because they haven't thought it through. They think of all sorts of short-range things. And they're largely conflicting and confusing, because they're not well thought out. But again, when it finally comes down to it, nobody wants to be God. Now then, when Oriental philosophy and religion was first introduced to the Western world, it was introduced under the auspices of people who were fascinated with power. their evolution need through the development of technology. And so at this time, people like H.P. Blavatsky were talking about the mysterious wisdom of the East. And they raised it, they amended it to us in a technological spirit. That there was psychic technology. That there was something that you could go way beyond anything that could be done through the physical sciences. You could cause your physical body to disintegrate to another level of vibration, and then transmit it and reassemble it somewhere else. You could live as long as you like because you control the fundamental processes. You could determine, if you decided to die, where you would be reborn. Exactly. You would be a complete master of life. And so there are still innumerable books being sold which present Oriental philosophy and religion in this light. That Charlotte Lobsang Rampa, who writes about Tibetan mastery. People read that because they think that there may be a way of beating the game. So therefore, the wise men of Asia were represented through this kind of propaganda as masters of life, as for example people whose emotions didn't bother them, who could put up with any amount of pain by simply turning off their feelings, who could foretell the future, who could read your thoughts, and who were above all kinds of ordinary human frailty. Well, when I first met Buddhist priests, Zen masters, Swamis, all these wise men from the East, one of the first things that impressed itself upon me was that they were perfectly ordinary human beings. They had bad tempers. They were fussy about certain things. They just acted as I would expect human beings to act. So at first I was very disappointed. I thought they had feet of clay. They didn't come up to these promises of psychotechnology. But after a while I got to realize why not. That they had already thought all that through. They had thought through what might be done if one had all these powers. And had decided that was what they wanted. The powers of this kind in Sanskrit are called siddhi, S-I-D-D-H-I. But there is hardly one decent scripture or text on yoga that does not say again and again, if you get siddhi, ignore them. Go on to something else. These are only the foothills. These are, furthermore, not only foothills, but they are seductive, blind alleys. Won't take you anywhere at all. Now I think this is the greatest possible lesson for the Western world to learn, because we are so hung up on the idea of power, of control, of being able to make everything go the right way, and we've never thought it through. When you get control, what are you going to do with it? Supposing I'm an outlet, and I have a secret closet full of love filters, very potent ones. If I see a desirable woman, all I have to do is to offer her a cigarette or give her a glass of wine with one of my secret potions in it. And instantly, I So when you think things through like that, you understand you do not want power. You don't want to control it. And therefore these Zen Buddhist masters that I've had and others were not super occultists. And very many Westerners who visited Japan expecting to get a satori, as a result of which they would know everything and control everything, were grievously disappointed and said there's not much in this after all. So therefore, from the standpoint of Buddhism, the fact that the power game is not the game is expressed by saying a Buddha is one who has gone beyond the gods. Because the gods have power. The Buddhism imagines all kinds of levels of heaven worlds inhabited by all kinds of gods. And the supreme of all the gods is called Ishvara. But it is said that all those gods in their paradisal worlds are in samsara. They're in the round of birth and death. And what goes up must come down. They're immensely successful. They're at the peak of power, spiritual power. And they're not delivered yet, because they still don't know what they want. And therefore in the exploration of what you want, you get to the point where having all pleasures at your command, and they pall, and you think of new sources of pleasure. And eventually you get like the ancient Romans, who had all these mad crowds of barbarians, who had to go every Saturday to the Colosseum for a show that really had to surpass everything. Because they had public baths, they had prostitutes, they had every kind of luxury. But when they went to see one of the big shows that people like Nero put on, they would have, for example, floats circling the Colosseum, all full of slave girls from distant parts of the Mediterranean, garlanded with flowers and waving in the crowd and going innocently around. And the next minute they would release wild lions into the arena to eat up all the slave girls. They got a big sadistic kick out of that. Because you see, pursuing pleasure beyond a certain place takes you into what the Buddhists call the Naraka world, that is to say the hells. When you have explored pleasure to its ultimate limit, the only thing you can get a kick out of is pain. So naturally, you descend from the Deva world at the top of the wheel to the Naraka world at the bottom, where it shows all these beings in states of torture. Now, of course, the priests say when they're bringing up children, if you do bad things, you will end up in the hell world. But this is a very inadequate way of showing how one gets to the hell world. You get to the hell world as a result of not knowing what you want. As a result of thoughtless pursuit of pleasure, which ends you eventually in the pursuit of pain. So when you're in the hell world, that's where you want to be. So then the question is, to clarify once more, what do we want? If you understand, first of all, that you don't want absolute power, you don't want absolute control, you want, yes, some control. You see, we always love controlling something that's not really under our control. Remember I gave this illustration right in the beginning of holding a gyroscopic top and feeling sometimes you're with it, but sometimes it's alive under your hand. And this sensation too, you often get, say, in driving a car or something like that, it's more or less under your control, but on the other hand it isn't. And that's the beautiful thing, because when something is partly under your control but isn't, then you have the same sort of relationship relationship with it that you have when you have someone you love, some other person. They're partly under your control because they've agreed to live with you and go along with you and so on, but also they're not. And the measure to which they're not is the measure to which they seem really alive to you. So then, we ask the question, if the motivation of power gaining disappears, you've seen through it and you know that's not what you want. What other motivation takes its place as the origin of actions? And it seems to me that the answer here is compassion. Simply because when you want to relate to another living being, what you really are asking of them is that they be in the same situation that you are. You want to meet and encounter someone else who has your problems, your fears, and your delights. You don't want a doll, you want another you, another self. Because that would be at least as surprising to you as you are. And so then at once, that when you see that that is the case, and that the most interesting thing in the world is the relationship with these others, and you can see at once yourself in the situation of all the other people, and then you think, no, I don't want to control these people. I would like them, yes, to be controlled in the sense that they were happy to do the things I would like them to do. But obviously I can't force that, because if I forced it, they wouldn't be happy. See, when you marry someone, when you have a family, you want your children, you want your relatives, you want your wife, etc., to be happy to do the things for you that they do. And so we say to each other, would you like to bring the washing in? And very often the answer is no, but I will. Because you see, we put it that way because we always hope that the things that we do for each other will be pleasurable to both sides. So a school teacher will get up in class and says, what nice boy will clean the blackboard. All these ways we use of trying to get voluntary cooperation, willingly given help. That's what we look for. But there is despite a lot of foolishness that goes on, this is a sound thing, you see, that there really is no greater satisfaction that you can imagine than that kind of personal relationship wherein you can trust a being who is other than you and not under your control to do for you what you want because they like it. As you, on your side, want to do something for them in that way so as to give pleasure to the other person. Let's take in sexuality where you get a kind of a critical example. The biggest part in sexual relationships is giving orgasm to women. And if that doesn't happen, many men feel disappointed because Because the thing that they really wanted to do was to give pleasure and get their own pleasure out of giving it. Now that's compassion. In the real sense of the word, feeling with and through someone else. Where the whole trick is that you lose control for a while of the situation and say, I throw the ball to you, now it's yours. Now I may seem, therefore, as a result of talking in this way, to be talking like a Jewish or a Christian theologian. Because that's what they say about God. That God did something called kenosis in the beginning of all time. Kenosis is a Greek word meaning self-emptying, self-sacrifice, giving up, and thereby conferred freedom of will and power to love on angels and human beings, and therefore took a terrific risk by trusting the other, by trusting a principle called other that's not under your control. But with God, of course, it is ultimately under his control. But he sits back and smokes a cigar sometimes and lets it go. See what the children will do. I would like to law the green bastards and big cigar. So, but you see, it's really, in a way, the same idea as the Hindu idea. When the Christian speaks of God giving the creature freedom of will, the Hindu says, no, God gets lost in that person and gives up power. And it's really the same thing. It's the idea that the all-powerful surrenders power. So that the more you give the power away, what you're really doing is you're othering yourself. Now the more you other yourself by giving power away, the more of a self you are. Because self and other are reciprocal. So you find that people who through a sadhana, a yoga discipline, have overcome their ego, have transcended the ego, are tremendously strong personalities. You would think theoretically they would all be non-entities and to lack entirely what psychologists call ego strength. But actually they're nothing of the kind. They are, every one of them, unique. They're all quite different from each other. And they are very, very, what I call strong characters. Because the more they have given it up, the more they get it. So, in this way of thinking, let's put it in another dimension for the moment. Let's suppose we're thinking of a relationship that is not just people. People are very obviously other and independent of one's ego. Give it to everything. Say to everything, which of course is going to include as much of yourself as you can objectivize. In other words, your stomach, your intestines, your everything, you see. Say to it all. Now it's your turn. Let's see what you're going to do. Let it happen. You know, you can do this complete let-off of control. And you find that I have to put it in a provisional way first. You get the sensation that everything else is living you. It lives you. That you've given away control, you see, to everything else. It's a lovely, irresponsible state to be in. But then, you see, you do the flip. In giving away the control, you got it. You got the kind of control you wanted. That's to say, where you had a loving relationship to the world, but you didn't have to make up your mind what it should do. You let it decide. Now, do you see that's how your bodies work? You don't have to make up your mind what your nerve cells are going to do. You've delegated all that authority. If the President of the United States has to lay awake at nights thinking what every official under his command is going to do, he can't be president. He's got to make an act of trust in all those subordinates to be responsible and carry on their things in just the same way as you make an act of trust to all your subordinate organs to carry on their functions without you having to tell them what to do. And this is the secret of what we will call organic power as distinct from political power. Lao Tzu puts it in this way: the great Tao flows everywhere, both to the left and to the right. It loves and nourishes all things, but does not lord it over them. And when merits are accomplished, it lays no claim to them. The more, therefore, you relinquish power, trust others, the more powerful you become. But in such a way that instead of having to lie awake nights, controlling everything, you do it beautifully by trusting the job to everyone else. They carry it on for you. So you can go to sleep at night, trust your nervous system to wake you up in the morning. You can even tell it, I want to wake up at 6 o'clock. It'll wake you up just like an alarm clock. This seems a sort of paradox to say this, but the principle of unity, of coming to a sense of oneness with the whole of the rest of the universe, is not to try to obtain power over the rest of the universe. That will only disturb it and antagonize it and make it seem less one with you than ever. The way to become one with the universe is to trust it as another, as you would another, and say, let's see what you're going to do. But in doing that, you see, in saying that to everything else that you have been taught to think is not you, you are also saying it to yourself. Because finally, as I pointed out, you do not know where your decisions come from. They pop up like hiccups. And when you make a decision, people have a great deal of anxiety about making decisions. There's this guy farmer, who ordered a help man to come in. And found he was an extraordinarily efficient worker, because the first day he put him on sawing logs. And he sawed more logs than anybody had ever sawed. It was fantastic. But they were all done in one day. So the next day he put him on to mending fences. And there were all kinds of broken fences around the farm. In one day he had them all done. I got to do with this guy? So he took him down into a basement and said, look, here are all the potatoes that have come in from this harvest. And I want you to sort them into 3 groups. Those that we sell, those that we use for seeding, and those that we throw away. So he left it at that. At the end of the day, the laborer came back and said, well, that's enough, mister. I quit. Oh, he said, you can't quit. I've never had such an excellent worker. I'll raise your salary. I'll do anything to keep you around. Ah, I said, no. All right, mending fences and chopping wood, but this potato business is decision after decision after decision after decision. So when we decide, we're always worrying, did I think this over long enough? Did I take enough data into consideration? And if you think it through, you'll find you never could take enough data into consideration. The data for a decision in any given situation is infinite. So what you do is, you go through the motions of thinking out what you will do about this. And then when the time comes to act, you'll make a snapshot. I mean, I'm speaking a little extremely, making some fun of it and so on, because after all, we do occasionally get the vague outlines and make a right decision on rational grounds. But we fortunately forget the variables that would have interfered with this coming out right. It's amazing how often it works. But warriors are people who think of all the variables beyond their control and what might happen. So then when you make a decision, and it works out all right, I think very little of it has much to do with your conscious intent and control. But somehow or other, you are able to decide and control things more harmoniously if you delegate authority. That's why very great businessmen are those who can delegate authority. Trust others to work for them. Because those are people developing businesses on the same basic structure that is fundamental to a living organism. Delegation of authority. It loves and nourishes all things, but does not lord it over them. And you see, then what is happening is this. The more you let go of it and trust it, as if it were quite other. The more you realize the inseparable identities of self and other. To go back, if you try to find the identity of self and other by subjecting other to self, no go. If on the other hand, you find it through giving self, that is control, over to other, trusting that, you may make a mistake, you may make a bad gamble, but in the long run you're acting on a principle which has the backing of evolution. This is the way biological evolution goes on, constant delegation of authority. That's why, obviously, the democracy is superior to the monarchy. Mr. Tocqueville has said that democracy is always right, but for the wrong reasons. Because there is operating in democracy the principle principle that Buckminster Fuller calls synergy. And synergy is the intelligence of a highly complex system, the nature of which is always unknown to the individual members. Because that goes back again to this point, that we're always entering a new environment.
New Orleans. It's so good to be back here. It feels good in here, yeah?
The chair has 4 legs. Now, an animal has one-track mind. For instance, the animal is coming after you with the idea of tearing your head off. You put the chair up, and all of a sudden he has 4 points of interest. He loses his original chain of thought because this agitates him. He can't comprehend those 4 points of interest. So what he does, he attacks the chair. He takes his wrath out of the chair. His mind now has been completely distracted from his original thought. He's the man that he stands. Come in, Mitch. Caesar. Mongo, Mitch. Hold in.
Light flat on the deck every morning for breakfast. There are all kinds of natural factors. It was just he touched the key where he was flowing with the course of nature. Everything cooperated because he had touched the key. He had made the act of faith, and he was just picking up, in other words, a practice which had been hundreds and hundreds of years ago had been followed by others who had worked it out by their great ecological awareness. you come out of this way of thinking to something which has, I would say, the most enormously creative and revolutionary social consequences. That it has become not virtuous, not self-sacrificing, and not anything like that. It has become the hardest practical policy to let go control to others, to give up trying to dominate the scene. Also, in a parallel way, it has become at this time in our history very much our practical politics. To learn how to enjoy ourselves. You can go to the Protestant people with their Protestant ethic who are against this kind of thing. Now say to them with great glee, it is your solemn duty to learn how to enjoy yourself. Why? Because in an age of leisure, people have really got to know how to enjoy themselves. Because if they don't, they'll smash the whole future of the human race. So a utopia has become not some sort of a dream, but an urgent necessity. We can't do without it. Because if we try to do without it, what's going to happen is that we are going to terminate our race in a mutual massacre of scapegoats. And so the present paranoia in the United States that is going on, where everybody is thinking up a new scapegoat and how great it will be to demolish them or get them out of power. All this kind of bickering and right and left politics has become irrelevant. Because we now have the opportunity of trusting our own intelligence, our own technology, to take the risk of doing what we want, which will work to the extent that we realize that what I want, basically, what I really want is what you want. And I don't know what you want. Surprising. But that's the kinship between I and thou. So when I ask, I go right down to the question. Should we start with? What do I want? The answer is I don't know. When Bodhidharma was asked, who are you? Which is another form of the same question. He said, I don't know. Planting flowers to which the butterflies come. Bodhidharma says, I know not. I don't know what I want. But when you don't know what you want, you've really reached the state of desirelessness. When you really don't. You see, there's a beginning stage of not knowing, and there's an ending stage of not knowing. In the beginning stage, you don't know what you want because you haven't thought about it, or you've only thought superficially. Then when somebody forces you to think about it, we go through it and say, yeah, I think I'd like this, I think I'd like that, I think I'd like the other. There's the middle stage. And then you get beyond that. Say, is that what I really want? In the end you say, no, I don't think that's it. I might be satisfied with it for a while. I wouldn't turn my nose up at it. But it's not really what I want. Why don't you really know what you want? Two reasons that you don't really know what you want. Number one, you have it. too. You don't know yourself, because you never can. The Godhead is never an object of its own knowledge. Just as a knife doesn't cut itself, fire doesn't burn itself, light doesn't illumine itself. It's always an endless mystery to itself. I don't know. And this I don't know, uttered in the infinite interior of the spirit. This I don't know is the same thing as I love. I let go. I don't try to force or control. It's the same thing as humility. And so the Upanishads say, if you think that you understand Brahman, you do not understand, and you have yet to be instructed further. If you know that you do not understand, then you truly understand. For the Brahman is unknown to those who know it, and known to those who know it not. And the principle is that any time you, as it were, voluntarily let up control, in other words, cease to cling to yourself, you have an access of power. Because you're wasting energy all the time on self-defense, trying to manage things, trying to force things to conform to your will. The moment you stop doing that, that wasted energy is available. And therefore you are, in that sense, having that energy available. You are one with the divine principle. You have the energy. When you try, however, to act as if you were God, that is to say, you don't trust anybody and you're the dictator, you have to keep everybody in line, you lose the divine energy. Because what you're doing is simply defending yourself. So then, the principle is, the more you give it away, the more it comes back. Now you say, I don't have the courage to give it away. I'm afraid. And you can only overcome that by realizing you better give it away. There's no way of holding on. The meaning of the fact is that everything is dissolving, that we're all falling apart. We're all in the process of constant death. And that the worldly movement set their hearts upon earth ashes or its constant like snow upon the desert's dusty face, lighting a little hour or two as it dawned, and all that Omarkayan jazz. You know, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the great globe itself, I all which is intended shall dissolve, like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. All falling apart. Everything is. That's the greatest system. See, that fact that everything is in decay is your help. That is allowing you that you don't have to let go. Because there's nothing to hold on to. It's achieved for you by the process of nature. So once you see that you just don't have a prayer, that's all washed up, and that you will vanish and leave no wreck behind, and you really get with that, suddenly you find you have the power. This enormous access to energy. But it's not power that came to you because you grabbed it. It came in entirely the opposite way. The power that comes to you in that opposite way is power with which you can be trusted. Of course, what we've been talking about is not so much a set of ideas as an experience, or shall we say experiencing. And this kind of seminar in comparison with encounter groups or workshops of various kinds, or experiments in sensory awareness, is now being called a conceptual seminar. Although concept. But the crucial question arises that an understanding, a real feeling understanding of the polar relationship between the individual and the world is something that operates, as we say, in your bones, and isn't just a view that you hold or a belief that you hold. It's so curious that the emphasis of the Western tradition in religion is primarily upon right belief. Do you believe in the right dogmas, the right doctrines? And only secondarily upon right action. Because what you believe is, in Christianity at any rate, far more important than what you do. Because one is saved through faith, not by works. And early in its history, the Christian church rejected the movement in the church which had been known as Gnosticism, from the Greek gnosis, which means knowledge. And in a way, there were some sound reasons for doing so. Because the Gnostics were what I would call anti-materialists. They divided human beings into three classes that were called, respectively, pneumatic, psychic, and hylic. The last one being H-Y-L-I-C, from the Greek hyli, or they would call it now Ele, meaning wood. So the people were spiritual, psychological, and wooden. And that is to say, the wooden people were those most absorbed in materiality and most closely identified with their bodies. And Orthodox Christianity rejected this sort of distinction because of the perfectly correct idea that material existence is not inconsistent with spirituality. This is something which most Christians have forgotten, but they do believe as the central principle of Christianity in what's called the incarnation. That in Jesus of Nazareth, Almighty God did in fact become material, become human. And by this process, initiated a transformation of the cosmos. In the words of Saint Athanasius, God became man, that man might become God. And you don't hear that from the pulpit very often. The Christian Church therefore emphasized pistis, or faith, as against gnosis, or knowledge, because they said you can never know God. God could never become an object of knowledge. And in this funny roundabout way, the Christian theologians were saying exactly the same thing as the Hindus. Only the Hindus do call this knowledge of God through faith, they call it jnana, which is the same as the Greek word gnosis. But just to give you a little sidelight on how words get mixed up in their meanings, we now have a class of persons called an agnostic. And an agnostic generally means a person who doesn't commit himself to any beliefs about the ultimate nature of things. He just says he doesn't know. But the original word, agnosia in Greek, meant a special kind of knowledge. It was called the dark knowledge of God. The knowledge of God in the cloud of unknowing, to use the title of a mystical treatise written by an anonymous 14th century English monk. This monk derived his ideas from a very mysterious figure who wrote under the name of Dionysius the Areopagite. Dionysius was a 5th or 6th century Syrian monk who had learned his mysticism from Porphyry, who got it from Plotinus, who was a Neoplatonist, and who probably got a great deal of stimulation from the intellectual world of Alexandria. And Alexandria, in the early years of the Christian era, was a tremendous exchange place between East and West. Buddhist monks visited Alexandria. It was one of the great centers of trade between Rome and India. And as you may know, all Rome's gold eventually went to India for the purchase of pepper. And as a result of this, the Roman economy collapsed. They bought too much luxury from India. India, in exchange, got Roman architecture. And you'll see a lot of Roman architecture in Indian temples. But Alexandria was the great center for the Gnostics and for Christian theology. And some of the greatest theologians, Clement, Origen, Athanasius, Saint Cyril, all worked out of Alexandria. Well, now going back to this strange monk, Dionysius, it was he who first put around the idea in Christian circles that there was such a thing as the knowledge of God by faith, by agnosia, really, by unknowing. And he, in a book which he wrote, a very short book called Theologia Mystica, he wrote a treatise on the higher knowledge of God, which might be quoted directly from the Upanishads in certain parts of it. The last section of it reads like the Mandukya Upanishad, because it's a series of negations. It says what God is not. And he goes very far, because he says that God is not one. He says our idea of unity falls far short of what God is. So does our idea of Trinity. So does our idea of spirit, our idea of mind, of justice, of love. All these things are not really God. And he says in another place, if anybody, having seen God, understood what he had seen, what he would have seen would not have been God, but some creature of God, less than God, some sort of angel or something like that. It's perfectly amazing to consider the influence that this man had. For writing under the name of Dionysius the Areopagite, he became identified, you see, with St. Paul's first convert in Athens. And legend has it that he was the first bishop of Athens and was martyred in Gaul, and where he's known as St. Denis. But St. Thomas Aquinas looked upon the writings of Dionysius the Areopagite as having the highest authority. And you could, if all the texts of Dionysius' work had been lost, you could restore most of it from quotations in St. Thomas. He wrote really two very important books. One was the one I said, the Theologia Mystica. The other was called The Divine Names. And these two books presented two phases of his theology. The book called The Divine Names was a discussion on the nature of God in terms of what God is like, by analogy. And this kind of knowledge of God he called kataphatic. From the Greek pheme, to speak or say, kata, meaning to say according to, that is to say, to speak by analogy. Where he used, though entirely negative language about God, This sort of discourse was called apophatic. And the word apo meaning away from, to talk away from, just as a sculptor, when he makes an image, reveals the image by removing the stone. And so Dionysus explained that one attains the knowledge of God by discarding concepts, which is exactly what the Hindus mean when they say of God one can only say neti neti, not this, not any conception. Thus in Hindu philosophy, the highest state of consciousness in samadhi is called nirvikalpa samadhi, which means literally non-conceptual. Vikalpa means a concept, nir is a negation. So the non-conceptual knowledge. Now people have greatly misunderstood this. They have imagined that unknowing the state of the highest contemplation was the acquisition of blank mind, from which you first discarded thought, you went on to discard perception, you went on to discard any kind of sensory content in awareness, until you were, so far as anyone could say, aware of nothing. And they supposed that this kind of catatonic state was mystical consciousness. This is often believed in India. If you go to the Vedanta Society and ask what do you mean by nirvikalpa samadhi, they will tell you that one in that state has no consciousness whatsoever of the sensory world, that he is completely absorbed, as you sometimes see in Hindu holy men sitting in a state where they are blind and deaf to everything going on around them. The founder of Chinese Zen, known as Huineng, described people like that as no better than pieces of rock and lumps of wood. He said it's a very serious mistake indeed to confuse sunyata, the Sanskrit word for the great void, which is both the ultimate reality and the consciousness thereof. It is a great mistake to confuse it with nothingness. It is rather to be thought of as space, or like space, because space is not empty. It contains the whole universe. And so in the same way, the state of mind of a person who is truly enlightened is not empty. It contains everything. But like space, it is not stained by what it contains. And it's often said in Zen imagery, you can't hammer a nail into space. You can't spit on the sky, soil it. If you try, the spit will just return and hit your own face. So they go on to say the consciousness in all of us, your basic mind is like space. It is completely pure. But of course by purity, they don't mean unsexual, which is of course what purity generally means in the Western world. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. A person who is pure in heart is generally understood as one who never has any naughty thoughts. You know what naughty means? Means vain, negative, empty. A naughty person, therefore, is one who doesn't amount to anything, it's just nothing. That's the real meaning. But this misunderstanding of the nature of contemplation existed not only in India, from which it was transmitted to China, but also in the West. You read many treatises on Western mysticism, and there's still the feeling that getting into a deep, deep trance, sometimes called rapture, again the word rapture, has undergone some transformation. We talk about rapture as people being beside themselves with pleasure. But to be rapt means to be taken away from the body. So also ecstasy, we now interpret as meaning in a state of high pleasure. But it means to be outside yourself, to stand outside yourself. Your soul has left you, it is with God. As Arabs say, all crazy people, be kind to them. They're not here, their soul is with God. But actually, if it can be true, as Buddhists say, that nirvana and samsara are one, and if it can be true, as Christians say, that the spirit can be made flesh, the word can be made flesh, then obviously the highest form of man is not sitting in a trance like a lump on a log, with a perfectly blank mind. Because if that were the highest state of consciousness, it would be an exclusive state of mind. A state of mind that shuts out life. And in that sense, it would not qualify for being what the Hindus call non-dualistic. They always speak of the highest reality as being not one, because one excludes many. Not nothing, because nothing excludes something. Not being, because being excludes non-being, and vice versa. So they use this word non-dual to mean that which doesn't exclude anything, which as it were has no outside. As we say, space has no outside. You can only have outsides inside space. You can't have any outsides outside space. There is no outside space, even though space may be curved, finite. So, if you want to think incidentally of that curved space, go and take a look at a photograph in Life, a book on mathematics, where there's a picture of a Klein bottle, which is a three-dimensional Möbius strip. A Möbius strip, you know, is a piece of paper that is twisted once and then joined, and it has only one side and only one edge. Now, a Klein bottle is a three-dimensional Möbius strip, and it only has one inside. It has no outside. So say it has an inside and no outside, or it has an outside and no inside. It's a fabulous little trick. But there's something like that would be the nature of space, as that which does indeed transcend the opposites. Not quite. We'd have to do one extra move on a circle to make it into a Klein bottle. You'd have to tuck its head through the side of its skin and make the aperture through the mouth continuous with the inside of the serpent towards the tail, you see. That's more or less what a Klein bottle is. So, what I'm getting to, I'm giving you something out of the general history of religions to show that what has been meant by the mystical state, the state of samadhi or awakening in certain traditions, is not this state of trance, but a state of consciousness in which you can perfectly well carry on your daily affairs. And of course, what is meant by a bodhisattva as the ideal type of Buddhist person is that he is not rapt, that he is actively engaged in the life of the world, because he has gone beyond the illusion that nirvana is to be found away from everyday life. So, what is then the point of meditation? Why meditate? Why do you have to hold on to a home? Or go to a Zen monastery? Or retire and be quiet? When this is only a withdrawal? Is there anything to be said for it? Well, meditation is in that sense, as a practice, as a discipline, is a very curious problem. Because from one point of view it's a help, and from another point of view a hindrance. And I think we have to understand, first of all, that meditation exercises are medicinal rather than dietary. The same could be said of LSD. A medicine, not a diet. Something that is described in Zen as when you want to open a door, or summon someone to open the door for you, you pick up a brick and you knock on the door. But you don't carry the brick into the house. When you need a raft for crossing a stream, you cross the stream on the raft, but you leave the raft on the bank on the other side. You don't go carrying it around. But a lot of people, when they get into meditation, or they get into religion, or into any kind of exploration of this sort, turn the door into a revolving door, and keep on going round and round and round, and never get through. They say what a gas it is to be in this revolving door. That's a good definition of a parasite. The person who goes through a revolving door on someone else's push. So there are all sorts of people in the religious racket who are going through revolving doors. They're very bitter about people who walk right through and leave the door behind because they say, well, you haven't paid enough respect. You must really understand religious one-upmanship. It's a tremendously important thing. And don't be caught out by this, because what happens is there's a little game going on which I'm going to initiate you into. And it's played in Zen, which is it works like this. If you go to a teacher and ask for spiritual instruction, or even if you come to a seminar like this, you are, by doing that, confusing yourself, because you are looking for what you're asking for outside, as if someone else could give it to you, as if you didn't have it. So the teacher knows that as long as you do that, you haven't understood. But he doesn't just tell you to go away. Or he may sometimes just say, go away, I'm too busy. And in any case, I can't tell you anything. Well, people won't take that for an answer. They won't take no for an answer. And furthermore, if he just said go away, they would just find some other teacher who would exploit them. And maybe keep them as followers for years, and acquire a great deal of money by so doing. But what he does is another thing. He tries to give them a put down, as if to say, you have a great long distance to go yet. Your attainment is not at all perfect. And they're always talking about other sects and other schools and saying, well, they haven't really got the point. You see? So that you keep losing faith in yourself. And feeling, my goodness, I haven't yet attained this thing. And that keeps you working. But all the time, you're being talked down. It's like someone who's a pickpocket and he's stolen your own watch and is selling it to you. But just so long as you can be talked out of yourself, you deserve to be. Now, you become very aware of this. If you ever do momentarily slip into some sort of mystical experience, you become aware of this tremendous gamesmanship going on. And you see it as sort of continuous with all sorts of cosmic games that are going on, of creatures eating other creatures up, and the creatures that get eaten, of course, transform themselves into the creatures that eat them, and then in turn eat other creatures. And you see the whole hide and seek game going on, and then you realize very clearly that the state of development that you are in now is no better and no worse than anybody else's state. Because it's like space again. Which planet is in, or which star is in the best position? Well, it's all equal. They're all in the middle. Any one can be considered the center one. Any point on the sphere is the center of the surface of the sphere. So, in the same way, everybody, in all his behavior, whatever he's doing, whether we call him from a certain point of view sick, or whether we call him healthy, whether we call him good or bad, neurotic, normal, psychotic, sane, all the manifestations are just like the leaves on the trees. And in each being in a unique way is, as Christians would say, manifesting the will of God. So, there really, from that point of view, there is nothing to do to attain Buddhahood. Nothing at all. But you see, that's very difficult to understand, because a lot of people, when they hear that there's nothing to do, try to do nothing. And you can't. Because you are karma, and karma means action. You can't do nothing. But the thing you're looking for, or think you're looking for, is what you're doing. Is what's called you. Only of course, as we all know, we've got ourselves into the idea that oneself is so difficult to see. Because it's like, as I've often said, trying to find your own teeth or look into your own eyes, and you can't find it. It's always behind. It's like your head is, from the optical point of view, a blank space. Neither light nor dark. It's right in the middle of everything. And so, one of the great tricks of gurus is to set people looking for their heads. There's a famous story of a king in India in ancient times called Yajnadatha. And one morning he woke up and reached out for his mirror, brought it over. No head. He was looking in the wrong side of the mirror. You know, he was kind of bleary-eyed and had a hangover. So he summoned servants and said, "Gods, I've lost my head. Find it." And they said, "But Your Majesty, it's there on your shoulders." He said, "It is not. I can't see it in the mirror. Nobody can show me my head." So they were rushing all over the place, looking for the head. Now the trick to that is, of course, that you're perfectly well aware of your head. Only not in a form in which you expect to be aware of it. You expect to be aware of your own head in the same way as you're aware of other people's heads. But that wouldn't be true of you, because you've got an inside view on your head. You have an outside view on other people's heads, because, of course, you're taking an inside point of view. But the way in which you are aware of your head is in terms of what you are seeing and hearing. Because all sights and all sounds are what the nerves inside your head are doing. That's how to be aware of one's head. You are aware, therefore, of yourself, the mysterious self that you have, in terms of experience. Because there isn't really any difference. But that always escapes people, you see. So perpetually, so long as you don't understand that, you can be talked into going on to all kinds of weird excursions. And just so long as you believe it, you're a sucker. You're hooked. And it takes a tremendous inner confidence and nerve finally to say, don't pull that stunt on me anymore. I see through your game. And because gurus are very clever at putting you down, but they're just trying to see how strong you are. They're testing you out. See if they can hoodwink you. So long as they can, you see, they're going to go on doing it, because they're going to get you to the point where they can't do it to you anymore. Then they'll graduate. And so, one of Rinzai's students, after he saw through it, said, well, there wasn't much in Rinzai's Buddhism after all. Of course there wasn't. He said boldly and straight out, my teaching is just like using an empty fist to deceive a child. You know, when you play games with a child and pretend you've got something here, the child goes into all kinds of tizzy to get you to open your hand and show what it is, and then there's nothing. Fooled. So you can't be fooled. As long as you can be fooled. When you can't be fooled, you don't ask the question anymore. Because it's all become clear. It's all become clear that there is no puzzle about this universe. What makes you think there are puzzles about this universe? Very simple reason. You're trying to explain it. And when you explain things, what do you mean by explanation? There are several meanings of explanation. There's really one basic meaning. But first of all, to be able to translate what is happening into terms of words or numbers. In other words, to describe. But a real explanation is not just a description. It's a description which enables us to control what we are describing. But didn't we see in the last session that to control the world is not really what we want to do? So that if all explanations have as their function enabling us to control things, then maybe an explanation will not be wanted. And furthermore, you can very simply see that what makes things complicated is explaining. When somebody explains to you how a flower works, and he's a great botanist, and analyzes all the innards of a flower, shows the channels, the fibers, the processes of reproduction, and so on that go on in it, everybody stands fascinated. See how complicated that is. How clever God must have been to create that flower, to have all that complexity. It's not complicated at all. It's only complicated when you start thinking about it. Because the vehicle of words is a very clumsy one. And when you try to talk about the processes of nature, what is complicated is not the processes of nature, but trying to put them into words. That's as complicated as trying to drink up the ocean with a fork. It takes forever. So this intense complexity that we see in everything is created by our attempt to analyze it all. And so what we do is, when we analyze, we use our eyes and ears as scalpels. And we dissect it. And we have to put a label on every piece we chop off. And so we scalpelize and we get it right down to atoms. Getting finer and finer, we suddenly go where we got to the end of it, because the word atom means what is not cuttable. Atomos. But then we found we could cut the atom. And lo and behold, big fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite. And it goes on forever. There is no end to the minuteness which you can unveil through physical investigation. For the simple reason that the investigation itself is what is chopping things into pieces. And the sharper you can sharpen your knife, the in a way. Because you see, what it does is it gives you the illusion that you've solved your problem. When you have controlled certain things, you have solved certain problems, practical problems. You say, fine, more of that, please. Let's go on solving problems. And then you do. You create a world of people, as we are today, far more comfortable than people who lived in the 19th century. Just remember the troubles of going to a dentist when you were children, or some of you when you were children, of medicine, of badly heated homes, of all sorts of things that we don't put up with anymore. But the problem is we keep running into this thing, then all constant stimulations of consciousness become unconscious. And when we take it as a matter of course to have certain comforts, then we switch the level on which we worry. When you solve a whole set of problems, people find new ones to worry about. And after a while, you begin to get that haven't we been here before feeling. Aren't we just going round on a cycle and doing the same old thing over and over and over again because we don't realize that we're chasing our own tails? By an eternally recurrent process of not knowing who you are. That is the hide and seek. That is the nature of what the Hindus call the Manvantara and the Pralaya, the period of the Manvantara in which the worlds are manifested, and the period of the Pralaya in which the worlds are withdrawn from manifestation. In and out, in and out. Evermore came out by the same door as in I went. The thing is to get to the point where you can see that you are doing that in every moment of your existence, with every tiny little atom of your body. You now, at this minute, you see, are the whole system of inning and outing. In other words, you often think perhaps, maybe a long, long time ahead, I shall reach the point where I wake up from manifestation and overcome the world illusion and discover that I am the supreme reality behind all this diversification. My friends, there is no diversification. In other words, what you call diversification is your game. In the same way as you chop the thing and then you say it is made of pieces. Well, you forget that you cut it. So when you see the world is complicated, and that there are life problems, and that you might one day succeed. Hundreds and hundreds of people are running like mad after something that they call that is success, and they have no idea what it is. So in exactly the same way, the Guru is keeping you running and running after spiritual attainment. You don't know what you want. This is where Krishnamurti is so clever. Because he says, if you ask me for enlightenment, how can you ask me for enlightenment? If you don't know what it is, how do you know you want it? And any concept you have of it will be simply a way of trying to perpetuate the situation you're already in. If you think you know what you're going out for, all you're doing is you're seeking the past, what you already know, what you've already experienced. Therefore, that's not it, is it? Because you say you're looking for something quite new. But what do you mean new? What's your conception of something new? Well, I can only think about it in terms of something old. Something I once had. So he doesn't say anything. He doesn't indicate anything positive. Everybody says, why are you so negative? Why don't you give us something to hang on? Well, the simple answer is it would be spurious. You don't need anything to hang on to. You're it. You don't need a religion. by all means, just go away. Don't go to gurus. Don't go to church. Don't enter philosophical discussions. Forget it. But then you'll realize that by having consented to forget it, you're still seeking. What a trap. What can you do? You see? If you stay here and listen to me or to anyone else who comes around here, you're fooling yourself. But if you go away, you're fooling yourself too. Because you still think that's going to improve your situation. It won't. And therefore, when you discover that it doesn't, you'll think, well, maybe it was a mistake to go away, and you'll come back to the guru. And he looks at you and says, you are very undisciplined, very inferior student. And you need to apply yourself. Well, as I explained what he's doing. But it comes down in a way to a sort of contest with the guru. See? Will you call his bluff? You're afraid. Because you might discover that if you do call his bluff, he's no better than you are. Well, that's what you're supposed to find out. But without being cynical. He's as divine as you. But you've got to call the bluff. There's going to be a showdown. And it's a double bind. The whole situation's a double bind. Because it doesn't do any good to stay here. It doesn't do you any good to go away. Either to do something about it or to do nothing about it. Now then, there's something else. When you understand that, and when you realize that there's nothing to realize, well, it's all here. Then what are you going to do? Well, of course, this is the sense of the Zen poem. The supernatural activity, the marvelous power, drawing water, carrying fuel. No. Do whatever one does as a human being. But there's an element of resistance in that. It's like when a child is pestering father or mother with all sorts of questions. They finally get down to the deepest metaphysical problems. They say, oh, shut up and eat your dough. And I wouldn't say that. Because life, as one looks at it, is in fact a celebration of itself. When you look out at night at the stars and you really wonder, good God, what is all that about? Well, it's a firework display. And it's celebrating High Holy Day. And it's whoopee. And the whole world is whoopee. It's a kind of exhilaration. And therefore the proper function of religion is digging this. It's not seeking. It's not seeking anything. But is, in a way, thanksgiving. That's why, of course, the Christians were right in calling the Mass the Eucharist, the Thanksgiving. Only they had such a complicated way of thinking about it that nobody could understand it. So, in religion, all religious exercises, whether they are meditative or whether they are ritualistic, are whoopee. They are not something you do in order to attain anything. They are like art forms, like dancing. They are expressive of attainment, of the attainless attainment. So here's another hang-up for you. When you go to Mr. Suzuki, who runs the Zen Center, he's a good disciple of Dogen, who brought Zen, a certain school of Zen to Japan in the 13th century. Dogen said, you can't sit and meditate unless you're already a Buddha. In which case, why meditate? Well, meditation is just the way a Buddha sits. And he called this sitting just to sit, not to attain enlightenment. The minute you do that, you see, you're not meditating. So you only become a good meditator if you're not looking for anything. And therefore, you realize what a great thing it is to be able to sit. And what a great thing it is not to dissect the world with your analytical intellect. To be able to look out at the water or the trees or at the floor and the light on it in front of you without calling it light or floor or trees or thinking that it has parts or thinking that it's complicated. It isn't. So when you can sit without thinking, not with an empty mind, mind you, I'm going back to that point. Not with an empty mind, but just a non-analytic mind, a non-probing mind. Where you're not creating problems all the time, by trying to control it, by trying to control your mind, by trying to control your experience, what you see and hear. You then just simply discover that there is no way of controlling what you're experiencing, because what you're experiencing is you. And to try and really fundamentally control that, this is going around in a circle. So if I would say to you now, what you have to learn is to let it happen. That's wrong too. There's no one to let it happen. If I say to you, accept your experience, be calm and open to things, that again perpetuates the illusion that you're something different from it. So we go round and round. But if there are some people who want to get together, and like we would get together to play poker, or to have a walk, go fishing, or sail a boat, if there are some people who want to get together to meditate, and have rituals, chant, great. It's an art form. And you can only use it and make it a good art form if you're not using it to get something. And this is what really is the bane of temples all over the world. You go into Buddhist temples where they theoretically don't believe in any god. But there are the people praying. And they're all doing it in order that we get a male child next time around, or that the horse recover from a disease, or that mama gets cured of the dropsy. And all these petitions are going on and on and on. People always coming to the temple to ask for something. Lowbrow people for lowbrow things, highbrow people for highbrow things. And there all the vendors sit outside and sell souvenirs and magic and charms, and all the people go in and do this. And all these serious priests sitting there, really having to keep up face and say, yes, we can't provide these services. On the other hand, if you go in to one of these temples, along with all the faithful followers, and have a ball, buy a bead, buy a candle, buy a this, buy that, buy some incense, go in and dig this great thing going on, salute the Buddhas or the altars or the crucifixes or what you will, but don't take it seriously. And this is one of the great important transformations of today in our consciousness, is that a great many people are finding out that religion is not supposed to be taken seriously. This is a shocking thing to many people. There used to be an old saying that a religion is dead when the priests laugh across the altars. That's true in one sense. When the priests know that they've got a racket going, they don't believe one word of it, and they're laughing across the altar because of all these suckers around doing it, then it's true. The religion is dead. But when the priests laugh at the altars, because they're having such fun, because this whole scene is so beautiful, well, it's the difference between some stuffy old Buddhist priest humming a sutra and Allen Ginsberg chanting a sutra. That's a thing to hear. Because it's people going, they go on for interminably. It's a bore. They're sick of it.
but they get paid for it. This is magical. But when Allen Ginsberg chants the sutra, everybody gets in a circle and he gets these little bells, and they get going. It's just like a jam session, where everybody is absolutely delighted. Well, that's the way to do it. And if you can't do it that way, forget it.